The deleted books of the Bible. In the silent shadows of ancient libraries, among forgotten parchments and manuscripts covered in the dust of centuries, rest narratives that once inhabited the heart of sacred scriptures, stories that were read in temples, quoted by prophets, revered by entire communities, and that at some point in history ceased to be part of the official canon, not because they lost their power, but because human decisions, councils, and historical transformations redrawn the limits of what would be considered sacred. Imagine for a moment texts that contained more detailed apocalyptic visions, dialogues between angels and patriarchs, revelations about the mysteries of creation and human destiny, pages that testified to the faith of generations, copied by hand by dedicated scribes, preserved as spiritual treasures. And then, in certain periods of history, these same pages were separated, classified as apocryphal or Deuteronomic, excluded from official compilations. What happened to these writings? Why did some texts remain while others were left behind? Was there something about them that challenged established structures? Did they contain truths that they preferred to keep hidden? Or were they simply considered less trustworthy in terms of authorship and antiquity? There are those who say that these books carry secrets about the nature of good and evil, about the origin of fallen angels, about prophecies that still echo in our time. Some reports suggest that certain passages from these texts were cited by the apostles themselves, recognized as a source of spiritual wisdom. However, at some point in the historical journey of faith, barriers were erected, and these narratives were left out. This is not a journey of accusations or conspiracies. It is an invitation to contemplate, with reverence and curiosity, what remained on the margins of the sacred, to understand that the history of the Bible is also the history of human choices, of political and theological contexts, of preservation and exclusion, and that perhaps as we look to these forgotten texts, we can find layers of spiritual understanding that still resonate in our search for meaning. Enter this mystery with us. If you want to walk through territories where history and revelation intertwine, follow this journey until the end. Stay close. To understand how certain books were excluded from the scriptures, we need to go back to the first centuries of the faith. In ancient times, there was no single Bible as we know it today. There were collections of sacred texts, different between Jewish and early Christian communities, transmitted orally and then recorded on fragile parchment. Each synagogue, each group of believers had its own compilations, its revered texts. Among the Jews, there were the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, categories that formed the core of the faith. But other texts also circulated, written between the Old and New Testaments during the intertestamental period. Books such as Tobias, Judith, Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, and Baruch. These writings were part of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures used widely by diaspora Jewish communities and early Christians. However, when the rabbis met at the end of the first century at the so-called Council of Jamnia, some say they established stricter criteria for the Hebrew canon. Texts originally written in Greek, or that did not have confirmed ancient Hebrew versions, were left out. Thus the Deuteronomic books, those that were in the Septuagint but not in the Palestinian Hebrew canon, began their journey on the margins. Among Christians, the situation was even more complex. In the first 3 centuries, different communities used different collections of texts. Some included the Book of Enoch, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas. Certain traditions mention that these writings were read in cults, cited as spiritual authority. It was in the 4th century, with the Council of Carthage and the deliberations of leaders such as Athanasius of Alexandria and Jerome, that the Christian canon began to take the form we know. Jerome, when translating the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate, expressed doubts about the Deuteronomic books, although he included them in his work. Centuries later, In the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, Martin Luther and other reformers rejected these books, considering them less inspired. As it is written in 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. But who defines what Scripture is? This question has been around for centuries. The Catholic Church, at the Council of Trent, 1546, reaffirmed the canonicity of the Deuteronomics. Eastern Orthodox churches maintained an even broader list. Protestants removed them completely or placed them in separate sections called Apocrypha. Thus, the same Bible began to have different contents, depending on the tradition. What do these choices reveal? That the formation of the canon was not an instantaneous divine process, but a human journey marked by theological debates, political contexts, and ecclesiastical decisions. It is not about conspiracy, but about recognizing that the preservation of the sacred passed through the hands of people, institutions, and times. Have you ever stopped to reflect on how these historical processes have shaped your own understanding of faith? Share your perception. Connect with this narrative. Now let's get into the heart of the enigma. What did these excluded books contain that made them so significant, and for some so problematic? Why did texts that were revered for centuries end up being left out of official compilations? The Book of Enoch is perhaps the most fascinating example. This ancient text, cited in the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament, tells the story of the Watchers, angels who descended to earth, united with human women, and gave birth to the Nephilim, giants mentioned briefly in Genesis 6. Enoch, the prophet who walked with God and was taken to heaven without experiencing death, receives detailed visions of the celestial kingdoms, the divine throne, the secrets of creation. Traditions mention that the Book of Enoch contains prophecies about the Messiah, descriptions of the final judgment, accounts of the origin of evil, and the nature of fallen angels. Why is a text cited by apostles, preserved in full by the Ethiopian Church, and respected by ancient Jewish communities, not part of the Western Bible? Some reports suggest that his detailed descriptions of angels and spiritual cosmology did not align with the doctrines that were consolidated in the first Christian councils. Others point out that its authorship was uncertain, attributed to Enoch, but clearly written centuries after his supposed time. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945, contains a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. Unlike the canonical Gospels, there is no narrative of miracles, crucifixion, or resurrection, just direct teachings, many of them enigmatic and mystical. If you bring to light what is within you, what you bring to light will save you, says one of the sayings. Why was this text not included? There are those who say that his teachings were too close to Gnostic currents, which emphasized inner knowledge and mystical experience above institutional authority. This made him dangerous for a church seeking doctrinal unity. The book of Judith tells the story of a courageous widow who saves her people by seducing and beheading an enemy general. It is a narrative of faith, cunning, and liberation. Why did Protestants remove it? Certain traditions mention that its historicity was questionable, with anachronisms that suggested it was a work of theological fiction rather than a historical record. The pattern repeats itself. Books that brought extraordinary visions, which expanded the understanding of angels, demons, prophecies, and the nature of the divine, were often the first to be questioned, as if there was a discomfort with narratives that did not fit perfectly into emerging doctrinal structures. This is not to say that these texts were deliberately suppressed by dark conspiracies, but it is impossible to ignore that processes of canonical selection were also processes of control over which stories would shape the faith, which views would be authoritative, which mysteries would remain accessible. The mystery lies not just in what was excluded, but in what that exclusion reveals about the tensions between spiritual revelation and institutional authority. Follow this journey with us. there is still a lot to discover. The stories in these forgotten books revolve around fascinating characters, some well-known, others obscure, all carrying narratives that challenge and enrich our understanding of the sacred. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, appears briefly in Genesis as one who walked with God, and he appeared no more because God took him to himself. Genesis 5:24. But in the book that bears his name, Enoch becomes a monumental seer, led by the archangels through the heavens, witness to the divine throne, scribe of heavenly secrets. He sees the fall of the angels, the judgment reserved for the watchers, the destiny of souls. His voice is prophetic, urgent, full of apocalyptic visions. In Hebrews 11:5 we read, "By faith Enoch was translated so that he would not see death, and he was not found, because God had translated him." Odin, this mysterious figure who moved between worlds, becomes in the apocryphal text a mediator of revelations that go far beyond what canonical scriptures reveal. Tobias is another central character. In the book that bears his name, he is a young Israelite sent on a dangerous journey, accompanied by the archangel Raphael in disguise. Love of a common man. Together they face demons, cure blindness, find love, and restore families. It is a narrative of divine providence working through protective angels, a more developed angelic theology than that found in many canonical books. Judith, the warrior widow, personifies courage and radical faith. When her people are besieged and desperate, she adorns herself, enters the enemy camp, seduces General Holofernes, and beheads him. Not with brute force, but with cunning and trust in the God of Israel. Her story challenges conceptions of gender and power, showing that liberation can come through the most unlikely instruments. The Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, lead a revolt against Seleucid oppression, defending the purity of the temple and Jewish identity. The books of Maccabees narrate battles, martyrdom, miracles, and the origin of the Hanukkah festival. They are texts of resistance, of militant faith, of a people who refused to be assimilated. Why were they excluded by Protestants? Some reports suggest that his teachings on prayers for the dead and other practices did not align with Reformed doctrines. And there are even more enigmatic characters in Gnostic texts. Mary Magdalene as a privileged disciple, recipient of Jesus' secret teachings. Thomas as the spiritual twin of Christ, bearer of mystical sayings. Characters who, in apocryphal narratives, occupy places of greater prominence and authority than in the canonical Gospels. What do these figures tell us? That the ancient faith was more diverse, richer in voices and perspectives than the official versions preserved. That there were multiple ways of understanding the divine, multiple narratives about redemption, resistance, and revelation. As it is written in Jude, verse 14-15, quoting directly from the book of Enoch, "Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied concerning them. See, the Lord comes with thousands upon thousands of his saints to judge them all." A non-canonical book cited as prophetic authority within the New Testament. Isn't this fascinating? If you want to continue exploring these hidden layers of faith, stay with us on this journey. Subscribe so you don't miss anything. At the heart of these excluded texts is a conflict that transcends the human, the battle between light and darkness, between revelation and concealment, between divine authority and institutional power. A conflict that is not only theological, but also political and spiritual. Apocryphal books often provide more dramatic and detailed views on the cosmic war between good and evil. In the book of Enoch, the Watchers, high-ranking angels, descend to earth not by chance but in conscious rebellion. They teach humans forbidden secrets, magic, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology. They corrupt humanity not only morally, but by introducing knowledge that, according to the text, belonged only to the celestial domain. There are those who say that these narratives expand our understanding of the origins of evil. It is not just a serpent in Eden. It is an angelic conspiracy that contaminates all creation. The Nephilim, giants born from the union between angels and humans, become tyrants, demonizing the earth. And it is this corruption that, according to Enoch, motivates the flood. A much more complex story than the condensed version in Genesis. In Gnostic texts, the conflict is even more radical. Certain traditions mention that these writings present the material world as the creation of an imperfect demiurge, not the supreme God. Salvation comes through knowledge, gnosis, that awakens the soul from its material prison. Jesus, in these texts, does not come to die for sins, but to teach the way of returning to the light through inner illumination. Why was this problematic? Because it challenged the hierarchical and sacramental structure of the emerging church. If salvation depends on direct inner knowledge, what is the role of priests, sacraments, and ecclesiastical authority? Some accounts suggest that texts with a strong mystical and Gnostic emphasis were systematically marginalized because they represented a threat to doctrinal unity and institutional control. But the conflict is not just between different theological views, it is also between preservation and loss. For centuries, copyist monks worked tirelessly to preserve manuscripts, both canonical and apocryphal. Some out of personal devotion, others out of obedience to authorities. There are reports of texts that survived hidden in monasteries, caves, and private libraries. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, remained lost for more than 1,000 years until it was rediscovered in Egypt. Traditions mention that certain texts were deliberately destroyed. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, heresies were persecuted. Books considered heretical were burned. Communities that preserved them were dispersed. Not out of gratuitous cruelty, but that leaders believed they were protecting the true faith from contamination. But who decides what is heresy? Who draws the line between authentic revelation and dangerous error? These questions do not have simple answers. The spiritual conflict in apocryphal texts reflects the historical conflict over who controls the narrative of the sacred. And yet, these texts have survived. They haven't completely disappeared. They remained on the margins, in the shadows, waiting to be rediscovered, as if there was an invisible spiritual resistance, preserving what should not be completely forgotten. What do you think about this conflict? Share your reflections. Be part of this conversation. What do the deleted books reveal? What secrets, teachings, and visions do they carry that have made them so precious to some communities and so suspect to others? Solomon's Book of Wisdom, for example, brings profound reflections on the nature of the soul, immortality, and divine justice. It presents a more developed view of the afterlife than many Old Testament texts, where Sheol, the abode of the dead, is portrayed as a place of shadows and silence. Here the souls of the righteous are in the hands of God, and death is just a test. There are those who say that these teachings profoundly influenced early Christian theology, even though the book was excluded by Protestants. The Book of Enoch contains the so-called Book of Watchers, which details the fall of the angels in a cinematic way. 200 angels, led by Semyaza and Azazel, descend on Mount Hermon, make a pact, take human wives, and give birth to the giants. Azazel teaches the making of weapons and ornaments. Semyaza teaches enchantments and roots. Humanity is corrupted not only morally, but through forbidden knowledge. Certain traditions mention that these accounts explain not only the origin of evil, but also the existence of demons. According to the text, when the Nephilim die in the flood, their disembodied spirits become the demons that torment humanity. A complex demonological cosmology that does not appear in the canonical books. In verse Enoch 1:9, we read the prophecy cited in Jude, "Behold, the Lord cometh with his holy myriads to execute judgment on all, and to condemn all the wicked." This text, dating from centuries before Christ, contains messianic and apocalyptic visions that resonate in the writings of the New Testament. The Nag Hammadi scrolls, discovered in 1945 in Egypt, brought to light an entire library of Gnostic texts: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Sophia of Jesus Christ. These writings reveal a mystical current within early Christianity, which emphasized direct experience of the divine, inner knowledge, and a cosmology where the material world is an illusion to be transcended. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I myself will become him, and the hidden things will be revealed to him." It is a promise of mystical union, of radical spiritual transformation. Why was this left out? Some accounts suggest that these mystical visions, which placed an emphasis on personal experience and direct knowledge, were seen as threats to the mediatorial authority of the Church. If each person can have direct access to the divine, what is the role of the ecclesiastical hierarchy? The Book of Jasher, mentioned in Joshua 10:13 and 2 Samuel 1:18, is cited as a source in the canonical scriptures themselves, but was never officially included. Traditions mention that it contained expanded narratives about the patriarchs, events of the Exodus, and conquest of Canaan. Its exclusion remains enigmatic. How is a book cited in the Bible not part of it? As it is written in Colossians 2:3, speaking of Christ, "In whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge." But where are these treasures? In the preserved pages or in the lost pages? Ancient revelations remind us that the search for the sacred has always been broader, deeper, and more mysterious than any official canon can contain. This is not about delegitimizing the preserved scriptures, but about recognizing that human spiritual thirst has always exceeded established limits. Follow us, as there is much more to discover on this journey. The deletion of these texts was not an isolated event, but part of a tumultuous transformation in the history of faith, a time when the ancient world was crumbling and a new religious order was emerging from its ruins. In the 4th century, when Constantine legalized Christianity and then made it the religion of the empire, the faith that had previously been persecuted now became persecuting. Pagan temples were destroyed, ancient libraries were looted, texts considered heretical were burned in public squares. There are those who say that the Great Library of Alexandria, a repository of invaluable knowledge, was partially destroyed during conflict. Religious beliefs of that time. The world in ruins was not only physical, but also intellectual and spiritual. The diversity of beliefs and practices that characterized primitive Christianity, with its multiple communities, interpretations, and sacred texts, was being replaced by a uniform orthodoxy, defined in councils and imposed by imperial decrees. Certain traditions mention that many of the theological disputes of this period were both political and spiritual. Defining the canon meant defining what was true Christianity, and consequently, who had the authority to interpret the sacred. Rival bishops, conflicting theological schools, emperors seeking religious unity to sustain political unity, all shaped the canonization process. The Gnostics, for example, were declared heretics. Their communities were scattered, your texts ordered for destruction. Only those deliberately hidden survived, such as the Nag Hammadi scrolls, buried in ceramic jars in caves in the Egyptian desert, waiting centuries to be rediscovered. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century brought another wave of ruins. Martin Luther questioned papal authority and, with it, the Catholic canon. The Deuteronomic books, Tobit, Judith, Maccabees, Wisdom, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, were removed from Protestant Bibles or relegated to a separate section of Apocrypha, considered useful but not inspired. Some reports suggest that this exclusion had specific doctrinal motivations. Maccabees, for example, mentions prayers for the dead, Maccabees 12:45, a practice that supported the Catholic doctrine of purgatory. By removing these books, the reformers eliminated textual bases for practices they rejected. The religious wars that followed, the 30 Years' War, the mutual persecutions between Catholics and Protestants left Europe in rubble. Millions died, cities were leveled, and at the center of these conflicts there is always the question, which version of faith is true? The world in ruins also reflects the spiritual consequences of this fragmentation. Communities that once shared a common heritage now saw each other as enemies. Texts that were previously read by everyone were now accepted by some and rejected by others. The unity of the spiritual body, so emphasized by the first apostles, was broken. But the ruins also reveal something. When we remove layers of destruction, we find preserved fragments, hidden scrolls, traditions kept secretly, spiritual memories that refuse to disappear completely. There is a tragic beauty in this, the resilience of the sacred in the face of human attempts to control or destroy it. As if the mystery of God were too great to be contained in any canon, any doctrine, any institution. Ruins teach us humility. They remind us that all human structures, no matter how sacred they claim to be, are temporary and imperfect. That spiritual truth is greater than our attempts to define and control it. If you feel the importance of preserving these reflections, sign up and walk with us on this journey. As certain texts became marginalized and forgotten, something profoundly significant happened. A simplification of understanding about evil, demons, and the nature of spiritual conflict. Rich and complex traditions were replaced by more linear and controllable narratives. In the canonical books, the origin of Satan and demons is mentioned only briefly. Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 contain passages that, interpreted allegorically, speak of the fall of an anointed cherub. In the New Testament, there are references to angels who sinned and were cast into Tartarus, 2 Peter 2:4, but details are scant. The Book of Enoch, on the other hand, offers a detailed cinematic narrative. The Watchers do not fall out of abstract pride, but out of concrete desire for the daughters of men. Adim, their rebellion has measurable consequences. The generation of the Nephilim, the corruption of humanity, the teaching of forbidden arts. And when the giants are destroyed in the flood, their disembodied spirits become the demons that torment the world. As it is written in 2 Peter 2:4, God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into hell, imprisoning them in dark abysses to be reserved for judgment. But who were these angels? What did they do? The canonical book does not explain, the apocryphal does. There are those who say that this simplification was deliberate. Detailed narratives about demons, angelic hierarchies, and forbidden knowledge could lead to magical practices, invocations, or fascination with the occult. Better to keep these matters vague, controlled by clerical interpretation, than to allow the popular imagination to explore them freely. But the consequence of this simplification was an impoverished understanding of evil. Satan became a almost caricatured figure, the tempter with horns and trident, demons, abstract forces, spiritual warfare, a vague concept. The complexity, the depth, the sense that the conflict between light and darkness has cosmic historical layers and deeply rooted in the structure of reality have been lost. Gnostic texts take this understanding even further. Certain traditions mention that in these writings, the creator of the material world himself, the demiurge, is portrayed as ignorant or malevolent. The rise of darkness is not just an angelic rebellion, but is woven into the very fabric of the physical cosmos. Salvation comes by awakening from this material illusion and returning to the transcendent divine light. These radical views were understandably rejected by the Orthodox Church, but its suppression also meant the loss of a powerful symbolic language to describe the human experience of imprisonment, alienation, and the search for transcendence. During the Middle Ages, when the Church had almost complete control over written knowledge, demonology became a subject reserved for trained theologians. Grimoires and magical texts circulated clandestinely. The Inquisition persecuted those suspected of possessing prohibited knowledge. And ironically, it was during this period of greater repression that the fascination with the occult intensified. Some reports suggest that the suppression itself fueled the obsession. Forbidden texts gained an aura of secret power. What was hidden seemed more true, more dangerous, more valuable than what was authorized. The rise of darkness did not only happen on the spiritual plane, but also on the plane of knowledge, where the forbidden became seductive precisely because it was forbidden. In the Renaissance, with the resurgence of interest in ancient texts, many scholars began to search for apocryphal manuscripts, grimoires, and hermetic writings. Alchemists, Kabbalists, and natural philosophers saw these texts as keys to unraveling the mysteries of creation. Traditions mention that great minds such as John Dee, Paracelsus, and Giordano Bruno dedicated their lives to the study of knowledge considered heretical, and many paid with persecution or death. The rise of darkness, therefore, is not just about demons and fallen angels. It's about what happens when knowledge is suppressed, when narratives are silenced, when access to the sacred is controlled by a few. The shadow grows not only through the presence of evil, but also through the absence of light, through the loss of texts, through the destruction of wisdom, through deliberate forgetfulness. And even today, there are those who say that we are experiencing the consequences of this simplification. A culture that has lost touch with the deeper dimensions of spiritual conflict, that treats the sacred as superstition or reduces it to superficial moralism. The rise of darkness continues, not because demonic forces are more active, but because we have lost the spiritual and intellectual tools to understand and confront them. But there is hope, because what was hidden can be rediscovered. What has been forgotten can be remembered, and each text recovered, each parchment translated, each manuscript studied, represents a small victory of light over ignorance. What do you think about these processes of concealment and revelation? Leave your reflection, participate in this conversation. Amidst the darkness of suppression and oblivion, there were always those who resisted. Communities, individuals, and traditions that preserved excluded texts, keeping alive the flame of wisdom that official history tried to extinguish. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has never abandoned the Book of Enoch. For them, this text is not apocryphal. It is sacred scripture, an integral part of their Bible. For centuries, while the West considered it lost or heretical, Ethiopian monks meticulously copied its pages into Ge'ez, preserving prophetic visions that would influence future generations. There are those who say that this preservation was not accidental, that communities on the periphery of the Christian Empire, far from the control of Rome and Constantinople, maintained an older, more diverse faith, closer to the Jewish roots of early Christianity. And with it, they maintained texts that the center considered problematic. Jewish communities in the diaspora, even after the fixation of the Hebrew canon, continued to study texts such as the Book of Jubilees, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and other intertestamental writings. Certain traditions mention that rabbinic literature, the Talmud, the Midrashim, contains echoes and references to these apocryphal narratives, preserving their memory in an indirect way. In the desert of Qumran, near the Dead Sea, an ascetic community kept an entire library of manuscripts. When discovered in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed copies of nearly every book in the Old Testament, as well as communal texts, commentaries, and, significantly, fragments of the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. This community, probably the Essenes, resisted the pressures of their time by preserving a rich and diverse textual tradition. During the Middle Ages, isolated monasteries became havens of knowledge. Copyist monks, even when official orders were clear about what should and should not be preserved, sometimes hid prohibited texts, Some reports suggest that marginalia, notes on the edges of manuscripts, contained quotations from apocryphal books, veiled references, fragments of wisdom that could not be completely erased. In the Islamic world, paradoxically, many ancient Christian texts have been preserved. Arabic translators, especially during the Islamic Golden Age, copied and studied Greek and Syriac manuscripts that in Christian Europe were considered lost or heretical. This multicultural preservation ensured that when the Renaissance brought renewed interest in ancient texts, there were sources available for rediscovery. Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in the 15th century changed everything. For the first time in history, texts could be reproduced en masse. And although the first printed Bibles followed the official canon, soon editions containing the Apocrypha began to circulate. Traditions mention that the King James Bible, in its original version of 1611, included the Deuteronomic books between the Old and New Testaments. The resistance of light was not only institutional, but also individual. Scholars such as Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century produced the Hexapla, a monumental work that compared 6 different versions of the Hebrew Scriptures, including the Septuagint with its additional books. His goal was to preserve textual diversity, not suppress it. Jerome, even though he expressed doubts about the Deuteronomics, included them in the Vulgate. Erasmus of Rotterdam, in the 16th century, produced critical editions of the Greek New Testament that challenged the authority of the Vulgate and encouraged direct study of ancient manuscripts. In the 20th century, the discoveries of Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea Scrolls represented triumphs of the endurance of light. Texts buried almost 2,000 years ago have resurfaced, challenging established narratives, opening up new possibilities for understanding the origins of Christianity and Judaism. And today, this resistance continues. Scholars, translators, mystics, and spiritual seekers work to make these texts accessible, to study them rigorously, to extract from them wisdom that still resonates in our time. The light resists, not through institutional power, but through the human passion for knowledge, for truth, for the sacred. As Jesus said in John 1:5, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not prevailed against it." This promise is fulfilled not only spiritually, but also historically, in the stubborn preservation of texts that refuse to disappear completely. Continue this journey of rediscovery with us. There are still profound revelations ahead. We get to the heart of the matter. What do these excluded books reveal about our own time? What prophecies, visions, and warnings do they carry that still resonate in our era? The Book of Enoch is not just about the distant past. It is deeply apocalyptic, looking to the end of time. His visions describe a final judgment where the fallen angels, the Nephilim, and all the wicked will be punished. But it also speaks of renewal, of a new heaven and a new earth, of a Messiah who will bring eternal justice. In 1 Enoch 90, 28-29, after describing the judgment, the text prophesies, "And I saw until a new house was built, greater and higher than the first. And all that were destroyed and scattered, and all the beasts of the field, and all the birds of the air, were gathered together into that house." A vision of cosmic restoration that resonates with the prophecies of John's Revelation. Some accounts suggest that Enochian views profoundly influenced early Jewish and Christian eschatology. Concepts such as the resurrection of the dead, the final judgment, the separation between the righteous and the wicked, the messianic kingdom, all appear developed in the Book of Enoch before being incorporated into canonical texts. As it is written in Revelation 21:1, "I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." Enochian echoes permeate this Johannine vision. The Nag Hammadi scrolls bring another prophetic dimension. In the Apocalypse of Peter, Gnostic, not the canonical, there are visions of Christ's crucifixion that reveal deeper layers. While the physical body suffers, the spiritual Christ remains above, laughing because death has no power over the divine. It is a prophecy about the victory of the spirit over matter, about the illusion of physical death. Certain traditions note that this dualistic view, body versus spirit, material versus divine, although rejected by orthodoxy, captures something essential about the human experience of budding. Eska, for transcendence. It is not about denying the body or the world, but about recognizing that our essential nature transcends physical limitations. The Book of Jubilees, another text preserved at Qumran, reorganizes biblical history into periods of jubilees, 49-year cycles. There are those who say that this temporal structure contains keys to understanding prophetic times, the cycles of judgment and restoration that characterize the biblical vision of history. Apocryphal apocalyptic texts, such as the Apocalypse of Abraham, the Apocalypse of Moses, the Ascension of Isaiah, all contain visions of the end times that expand and deepen canonical prophecies. Angels reveal celestial secrets, show the realms beyond, explain divine plans for human history. The prophetic climax lies not only in the content of these texts, but in what their existence reveals. That the human hunger to understand the future, to penetrate the divine mysteries, to see beyond the veil that separates the visible from the invisible, has always been broader than what official canons could satisfy. And perhaps this is the most important prophecy, that the human spiritual search will always exceed institutional limits. That there will always be texts in the margins, unauthorized visions, mystical experiences that defy ecclesiastical control. Not because they are superior to what has been preserved, but because the divine mystery is inexhaustible. We live in a time of rediscovery. Lost texts are being found, translated, studied. What does this mean prophetically? Perhaps we are in an era where hidden truths must come to light, where spiritual diversity, suppressed for centuries, is re-emerging, where forced unification is giving way to respectful plurality, as it is written in Daniel 12, "But you, Daniel, close up these words and seal up this book until the time of the end. Many will search it, and knowledge will multiply." Are we in that time? When are sealed books opened? When do ancient wisdoms return? We are not absolutely sure. But there is something profoundly significant about the fact that, in our era, manuscripts buried for millennia are resurfacing, being studied by millions via the internet, challenging established narratives. Perhaps it is part of a larger movement, a progressive revelation, where successive layers of spiritual understanding are unveiled. If you feel like you are part of this journey of rediscovery, sign up and walk with us until the end. The consequences of the exclusion of these texts reverberate to this day, shaping not just theology, but culture, politics, and the very way we understand spirituality and authority. The first consequence is epistemological. Who has the authority to define the sacred? For centuries, this authority belonged to institutions, church councils, religious leaders, established hierarchies. But the rediscovery of apocryphal texts challenges this monopoly. If books revered by ancient communities were excluded for political or theological reasons, can we fully trust the established canon? This is not about rejecting the canonical scriptures. They carry profound wisdom and are the basis of faith for billions. But recognizing that the canonization process was human, fallible, influenced by historical contexts, makes us more humble. It opens up space for questions, for searching, for recognizing that the divine mystery cannot be completely captured by any collection of texts. The second consequence is theological. The exclusion of books like Enoch has impoverished our understanding of angels, demons, and spiritual cosmology. Rich traditions about the nature of evil, the celestial hierarchy, the origin of the Nephilim, all of these have been simplified or lost. Certain traditions mention that this simplification has left faith communities less prepared to deal with complex spiritual experiences, with the real evil they encounter, with the nuances between light and shadow. The third consequence is cultural. The Protestant Reformation, by removing the Deuteronomics, created divisions that persist. Catholics and Protestants to this day use different Bibles. This is not just an academic issue. It affects liturgies, doctrines, the very way different communities experience faith. The exclusion of texts became a marker of religious identity, a dividing line between traditions. There are those who say that these divisions weakened Christianity as a whole. Religious wars, mutual persecution, decades of conflict, all because of disagreement over which books were inspired. The consequences were human misery on a massive scale, collective traumas that have not yet completely healed. The fourth consequence is spiritual. For searching individuals, the discovery of apocryphal texts can be liberating or confusing. Liberating because it opens new horizons, new ways of understanding the sacred. Confusing because it destabilizes certainties, questions what was taught. I consider it to be absolute truth. Some find in Gnostic texts a language for mystical experiences that institutional religion did not validate. Others discover in Enoch explanations for questions that the canonical texts left unanswered. There are those who completely move away from organized faith, seeking individual spirituality fed from different sources. The fifth consequence is academic. The study of the Apocrypha transformed the historical understanding of Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. We discovered that these traditions were much more diverse, complex, and plural than we imagined. There was not one Judaism, but Judaisms. There was not one Christianity, but Christianities. And the texts that officially survive represent only one current that won historical debates. This more nuanced understanding is a direct consequence of access to previously lost or suppressed texts. And it is changing how seminaries teach, how scholars interpret, how ordinary people understand their traditions. The final and perhaps most important consequence is the invitation to intellectual and spiritual humility. Recognize that we do not have complete access to the entirety of divine revelation. What texts were lost, burned, forgotten, that our understandings are partial, our certainties provisional, that the mystery of God always exceeds our attempts to systematize it. This should not lead to relativism, the idea that everything is equally valid and nothing matters, but it must lead to humility, recognizing that others can access dimensions of the sacred that our tradition has not preserved, that we can learn from each other without abandoning our roots. The consequences of deleted books teach us that the history of faith is complex, sometimes contradictory, always human. And perhaps our task is not to defend established canons with dogmatic rigidity, but to sincerely seek the truth wherever it manifests itself. Share your reflections on these consequences. How do they affect your own spiritual journey? We have reached the end of this journey through the shadows and lights of deleted texts. What have we learned? That the history of the sacred is also the history of human choices, about what to preserve and what to let go, what to authorize and what to marginalize, what to illuminate and what to keep in the shadows. The deleted books of the Bible are not mere historical curiosities. They are windows to understand how faith was formed, how religious authority was established, how ancient communities struggled to define what was divine and what was human. They are mirrors that reflect our own questions about truth, authority, and spiritual quest. There are those who say that each generation must rediscover the sacred for itself, not just repeating what was transmitted, but questioning, investigating, seeking. Apocryphal texts invite us to do just that, not to passively accept established narratives, but to delve into the complexities, the contradictions, the multiple voices that bore witness to the divine mystery. This does not mean rejecting canonical scriptures. They remain a solid foundation, tested by time, preserved by the devotion of countless generations. But recognizing that there is more, there is always more, makes us more complete seekers, more humble, more open to the breath of the Spirit who, as Jesus taught, blows where he wills. As it is written in John 21:25. But there are still many other things that Jesus did. If they were all related one by one, I think that the whole world would not be able to contain the books that would be written. If not everything Jesus did was recorded, how much more is there that we don't know about the totality of divine revelation? The deleted books remind us that the closed canon does not mean that revelation has ceased, that God continues to speak through rediscovered texts, through authentic spiritual experiences, through creation, through others, through contemplative silence. The task of faith is not to defend rigid boundaries, but to remain open to the mystery that always exceeds our understandings. There are traditions that have preserved what others rejected. There are communities that have found God through paths that most do not recognize. There are texts that, although excluded from the official canons, continue to feed thirsty souls. All of this is part of the inexhaustible richness of the human search for the divine. And perhaps the most profound lesson is this: that spiritual unity does not require uniformity, that we can honor our specific traditions while respecting the validity of others' experiences, that the mystical body of seeking humanity is vast enough to contain multiple expressions of the sacred. We thank you for walking with us through these forgotten narratives, these marginalized wisdoms, these voices that still echo through the centuries. Your presence here, your openness to contemplate these complex issues, is part of this resistance of light that spans generations. But this is not a conclusion, it is a portal. Because beyond these deleted texts, there are other layers of mystery waiting to be explored. There are more questions than answers. There is more depth than any video, any book, any tradition can completely contain. The invitation remains. Keep searching, keep questioning, keep contemplating. The sacred is not exhausted. It only reveals itself progressively to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. There are layers upon layers of revelation yet to be discovered. Mysteries that await those willing to look beyond the obvious, to question the established, to honor both tradition and quest. And each step on this journey reveals not only ancient truths, but also who you are becoming along the way. Stay with us. The journey continues, always deeper, always more revealing. Connect, follow, and may the light of understanding illuminate your path.